Hi, I'm Susan Weisbauer, co-author of The Well-Trained Mind.
And I'm Susanna Jarrett, editor at the Well-Trained Mind Press. And we're talking about education for all parents and for all children in all sorts of settings. And on today's episode, we're talking about kids, screen time, and technology. When to use it, how to use it, what's the right balance.
And I should point out right now that you and I are interacting on screens. I am looking at Susanna on a screen and she's looking at me on a screen.
Yes, a little behind the scenes. We do not shoot this in person. We use some great technological tools that make recording ourselves and splitting the audio for our editor and everything really, really easy. So,
which is great. And that this just sort of leads us into talking about technology generally. I don't know about you, Susanna, but I have found, and I think a lot of people found this over the COVID years, the ability to do remote meetings has been life-changing. I got to tell you, here in Virginia, it's 1:16 p.m. and I'm still wearing my pajamas because today was a meetings day for me. I had 3 meetings this morning. I've got another meeting after you and I finish talking about technology. And for all of it, I am in my pajamas. So,
Great.
I find this to be a good thing.
A blessing and a curse, because if not presume, you couldn't have 5 meetings in a day, I don't think, which is exhausting in its own right.
That's a good point. That's a good point. And I'd have to go out to lunch instead of eating leftovers out of the fridge, which I just did.
Right. But we're talking about technology because it's a hot button issue, especially for parents who are educating at home, finding that balance, because you are also using technology at home for entertainment, but also for education. And there's a lot of fear about screen time, and I think some justified fear about social media, being on screens too much. I was reading an article from the Mayo Clinic that I will link in the show notes that links excessive screen time for kids to obesity, inadequate sleep cycles, attention issues, speech delays, all sorts of problems. So this makes me think, should we throw our computers in the bin and don our aprons and whisk our children to the woods and have this aesthetic homeschool experience unmarred by technology, which I think there are homeschool Instagram accounts that kind of make it look like that's how homeschooling should happen in the woods.
Which is a little ironic, isn't it?
Right, because they're on Instagram.
Because they're on Instagram. Yes, but
so
go
you
on.
have to be aware. Right, you have to be aware. But it can look so pretty, to just go into your clubhouse in the woods with your chalk and your blackboards and do your homeschool. However, we here recognize that these new technologies are really going to be part of our lives and our children's lives forever when they're with us, once they grow up, inevitably. So we can't just ignore that.
No, and the response to technology, and here we're not just talking about screens, but we're talking about like ChatGPT and all different forms of AI and all technological innovations. I could give you a reading list. We'll put it in the show notes.
Yes.
All technologies have an ethic, and all technologies prioritize some things as morally better than others. All technologies change our lives. There's no getting around it. And there's been so much good work done on this. Marshall McLuhan, of course, the classic, Neil Postman. So we'll link some titles if you want to read up on it. But I think that what we have to recognize is that when a new technology comes along, if that new technology is useful, it will be part of our lives. We can't resist it. So a couple of things maybe for our listeners to consider. The Luddites. I don't know how many of you know about the Luddites, but the Luddites were a group of weavers who resisted factory development, resisted mechanization of their work in the late 19th century because they realized that if a machine could do their work, they were going to be thrown out of a job. And so they protested and they broke the new technology and they rioted, and a lot of them got thrown into jail. There's a wonderful book by Kirkpatrick Sale about this, which we'll also put in the show notes. The thing to realize about the Luddites is they lost. Resisting a new technology rarely works. In fact, I was going to say never. I'm going to say rarely because logic tells you that you shouldn't use an absolute. I cannot think, though, of a historical example of people who successfully resisted a new technology in order to hold on to a previous way of life. So screens as a sort of, shorthand for computer-based technologies are going to be with us, and simply turning away from from them, I think, is not the answer. I'm going to give you a movie recommendation if I could.
Yes, I'll always take a movie recommendation. While we're here about screens.
I know. Well, exactly. I don't like horror movies, but I think you do, Susanna.
I do. I do like a good horror movie.
I don't like horror movies, but I did like very much The Village, which is an M. Night Shyamalan movie, which is an exploration of what happens when a well-meaning group of people hoping to preserve a better way of life turn away from technology and try to simply remove it from their lives. And I'm not going to ruin it for you. And I know this is a movie that people either love it or hate it. I find it to be very profound in terms of how pointless it is to resist technology. So we're not going to talk about resisting technology.
We're going to talk about using technology as a tool, right?
Yes.
Because if technology is inevitable, then how can we teach our children to use it responsibly and efficiently? I would consider myself to be a little bit of a Luddite in the sense that I'm always suspicious of new things. When we were about to have our baby, a friend offered to let us borrow their snoo, which is this new bassinet.
Snoo.
It's a snoo. And
I have never heard of this.
It's $1,000 crib.
Oh, geez.
And what it does is you put your baby in it. It swaddles your baby in a way they can't turn over. And then it senses your baby. And when your baby starts crying, it will rock and it will change settings. It has settings like being in a car. It has settings to make it simulate other types of things that babies like. And at first I was like, I don't want a robot rocking my baby to sleep, but I did definitely use that a lot. And now she sleeps great. And when it was between putting my baby in what we call robot mom and sleeping through the night, robot mom won out. So,
oh my goodness, this is my youngest child is 22 now, so this is just so far outside of my experience.
But at first, I told my husband, "I'm a Luddite. I do not want to put my baby in robot mom. I'm the mom. I do the rocking," and that changed as I got tired.
Oh, very interesting. Very interesting.
But anyway, we're here to talk about using technology as a tool, and we're going to go stage by stage. So we talk a lot about classical education on the podcast. We'll go through the grammar stage, the logic stage, and the rhetoric stage, and kind of this gradual preparation and release of students into the world of independent technology use.
So we'll start, as we usually do, with, actually, maybe we should start before the grammar stage. Maybe we should start with preschoolers, because there are a lot of screen-based technologies that are targeted at preschoolers.
Yeah.
So without being a Luddite, I will say that I think, generally speaking, the principle is the younger the child, the less screens there should be.
Right.
But there's very good reason for that. It's not that the screens are bad. It's that young children are still learning how to read physical cues. They're still learning how to interpret facial expressions. They're learning how to interpret tones of voice. They are learning how to relate to other people. And that takes a long time. It takes, a vast, I don't know if, when you were little, I remember one of the things I would always say to my parent, I would say to my mother in particular, "Are you mad at me?" Because she'd have this very serious frowny expression on her face. And generally speaking, she would say, no, I'm fine. I'm just concentrating, because she was working so hard at whatever she was doing there. But that sort of becoming attuned to the people around you is a really big and important task of being a small child.
Right.
And anytime a child is on a screen, then they're not being attuned to that. Really, it's like learning a language. They're learning human reaction as a language.
I was actually looking at the CDC website, and they recommend no screen time for kids under 2, which seems pretty extreme, I know, except for with the exception of video calls with family members. So I think the more you can limit it before school age, probably the better. Obviously, I know it's sometimes really, really helpful to use a screen for 10 minutes while you're finishing dinner, baby's watching Miss Rachel or something of that nature. But I know that the CDC recommends as little as possible for those very early years.
Well, and I think that's a good principle, but I'm going to just put a but in there, which is that, so I think we'll get into this as we start talking about grammar stage. So there's a difference between using a screen for entertainment and using a screen for education. And I think actually for grammar stage, so maybe we should just sort of move into talking about the grammar stage, that there is very little education that should be screen centered. But there's absolutely no reason why you can't use it for entertainment. You know, we grew up, well, I was going to say we all, but I'll just speak for myself. My parents were very anti-screen, but when we went to visit my grandparents on the weekends, we watched cartoons for 6 hours and ate Fruit Loops because those were the two things we weren't allowed to do at home. And we were perfectly fine, you know. There's nothing wrong with a little entertainment indulgence as long as you're thinking to yourself, this is entertainment. And don't sort of, I was going to say fool yourself. That sounds kind of harsh, but I think that's true. Don't fool yourself that something really educational is happening.
Right. Yeah. And we've talked about that previously on the podcast, that there's a difference between education on a screen and entertainment on a screen. And little kids, it's probably just too much stimulation for them to be really, really learning something. So it's important to make that distinction.
And also, and we've talked about this before as well, for grammar stage students, so we're talking elementary, grades 1 through 4, there is so much language learning that still has to happen that kids really need to be learning through the medium of language because it's harder than learning through screens. Screens are easier. And when children are younger and their minds are so receptive and still so plastic and malleable, I think it's very important that you really emphasize language-based learning as opposed to screen-based learning. But, you know, I had 4 children under the age of 10 at some point. And did they watch Robin Hood, the cartoon one with the fox?
I
loved that. Did they watch that at least twice a week? Yes, they did. And somehow they all graduated from college and turned into functional adults. So yeah, it's a great break for mom. But I think that would bring me to a principle that I would lay out, which is I don't think that online school, online classes, online courses are good for children under about 5th grade.
Yeah.
And in fact, at the Well-Trained Mind Academy, 5th grade is where we start. We don't offer online elementary classes.
Right. I think a lot of folks who had to do online school during the pandemic found that at those younger years, it was really, really hard. And there's, you know, a level of independence that working on a computer sort of implies that they may not be ready for yet. They may need more handholding, more the teacher being able to see their work just right in the moment as they're going than like an older student would need.
Well, I mean, I think there are 2 aspects. One is that, again, to go back to what I said earlier, face-to-face learning with an actual person allows them to develop that knowledge of visual cues, oral clues, being able to really follow what another human being is not only saying, but also implying. And because grammar stage children are still developing that, then to remove them from it by putting the teacher on a screen or not having a teacher at all really does them a disservice. But then also, Susanna, I think you've had some experience with grammar stage students taking shortcuts.
Yeah. I mean, it's easy to do and not even all the time intentional. But if you do have a student using an online program, especially not like with a teacher, but just an online enrichment program. When I was teaching public school, we had our students who were behind in reading comprehension, for example, use really popular online reading comprehension enrichment programs. And it was just really easy for them to figure out how to game the system, whether it was, you know, taking and retaking tests until they just got the answers right, which a lot of programs will allow for, or whether it was using, and this actually is a thing, using cheats from TikTok, where large, really major learning platforms like Time for Learning, there's TikToks that may have like a cheat code on there. So just be aware of that our kids are sometimes better with technology than we are. And sometimes it's not intentional and sometimes it's intentional, but they can kind of game the system. And so you have to be really careful with that.
Well, I think it's a maturity issue, right? So when you are in elementary school, you are by definition immature. And part of immaturity is trying to do things as easily as possible because to be, and I say this a lot in my workshops and in my lectures, maturity means that you're able to put off immediate gain for a long-term goal. So you're willing to do something which is not immediately pleasurable because there's going to be a greater payoff down the road.
Right.
When you are immature, so you are a 2nd or 3rd grader, you are actually mentally incapable in many cases of grasping this sort of delayed reward.
Right.
Right. So it's not that kids are being sneaky. It's that they are doing the natural thing, which is they're finding the most straightforward and quickest way to get the task done. Right.
And when you add to that, I taught at 2 different one-to-one Chromebook schools. So every student had their own Chromebook. And to be honest, oftentimes that was so much more trouble than it was worth, because for these young children with constant access to a Chromebook, resisting the temptation to click away to a game that all their friends were playing, to click away to a social media post, or if they receive a notification on their email, not open it during class, is so hard for a little kid. These are dopamine rewards that they're seeking, right? And when they're so young, it's really hard to resist. It's hard for adults to resist answering or looking at notifications on our phones when we're supposed to be doing more important work. And so for little kids, like you said, who are by definition immature, almost impossible. And so to require that of them or just punish them for not being able to resist the temptation is so much harder than just sort of supervised access to the internet and computers when necessary, but not that constant access, because constant access is constant temptation.
So, Susanna, what was the thought process behind giving each student a Chromebook?
The thought process behind it is that I didn't make the decision, but I would assume it was something like, we live in this digital world, and kids who have better technology have a huge advantage in learning. They can look things up. They can use these programs. Especially at that time, we were doing a lot of post-pandemic, hybrid work where we still had a lot of our assignments online that they were accessing that way. And so they all kind of needed access to the internet and technology to get their work done. And so providing them with that kind of made the playing field more equal, which I totally understand. But the result of it was that they all had one all the time in their backpack or on their desk. And that was the hard part.
It's interesting when you think about it, that giving each child a Chromebook sort of implies that the most important thing for them is to learn how to research and to learn how to access resources. But when we're talking about elementary students, that really dismisses the importance of having a body, right? So a big part of maturity is growing into your bones and your muscles and moving around and interacting physically with other people, even, being bored. So you have to think of something to do with your body because nothing is entertaining you at that particular moment. It's a very dualistic sort of view of human nature to think that your brain is the only thing, and not even your brain, your mind, because brain is an organ, a brain is a physical thing, but your mind is the thing that needs to be educated. We talk a lot in classical education about educating the entire person, and physical awareness, physical exercise, using your body, all of those things that we do when we're not in front of a screen are such a big part of that.
Right. And I think that's so important for younger kids and older kids. But we saw that, we probably all felt that during the pandemic, where you could get really, really tired of being on screens all day. I know my kids did when they were doing Zoom school from 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. And we were requiring them to be on camera the entire day. I mean, they were just exhausted. And so because you don't have that, those moments of bouncing around and those assignments where you're actually moving and looking at things and touching things. And so that, being homeschoolers, we have the opportunity to do that, and would really encourage to do that as much as possible.
After we finish recording this podcast, I will be going to my 4th Zoom meeting of the day, Susanna. It's just been that kind of a day. And as my reward after that, I get to go ride a horse. So,
yay!
So
even adults need to move and go outside.
Get away from the screen and go use your bodies. That's exactly right.
Right. All right. So for a summary of the grammar stage, we would say that kids are using technology for specific purposes, but maybe more limited and supervised access to the internet versus a full online curriculum.
Yep. Yes, absolutely.
We'll be back after this.
Grammar for the Well-Trained Mind is a complete grammar curriculum for middle grades through high school. This program's unique instructional design has students cycle through material 4 consecutive times to fully master the mechanics of proper English usage. If teaching grammar intimidates you, have no fear. Each lesson is short and scripted, so there is no prep work for the teacher. You can open up the core instructor text and go. Students follow along in their matching workbook and can review detailed explanations for their work and the corresponding key. Grammar for the Well-Trained Mind, the efficient and effective grammar program, can be paired with any writing curriculum, including Well-Trained Mind Press's Writing with Skills series. Check out samples on our website, welltrainedmind.com, and use the code PODCAST at checkout for 15% off your purchase.
But then they start to get a little bit older. So let's talk about the logic stage. And, this is an important phase because I think at this point, you really can't say no screens. Mm-hmm. You've got to figure out how to incorporate using the internet, using documentaries, and we'll talk about smartphones. Actually, let's just sort of get the smartphone thing out of the way if we could. The problem with a smartphone is how intrusive it is.
Yeah.
And so I personally feel, without being a Luddite, that logic stage kids, middle school kids, should have access to a phone, but not necessarily a smartphone. They should be able to have some way to contact you because this is the point where they're going to have to be a little bit more independent. They're going to be away without you. They're going to be, maybe in a co-op group, or they're going to be going on field trips, and they do need a way to contact you, but they don't need to have the internet at their fingertips all of the time. So absolutely cell phone, but old flip phone without internet access would be my suggestion.
Yeah. I had a student who had a smartwatch instead of a phone, and I was impressed because she had conversations with her parents about it. She was in, I think, 7th or 8th grade. She was on board with it. She sort of understood their logic for not allowing her to have a phone with social media on it. And she was able to contact people, text people, have a watch. A lot of the features that are important for kids to have, her parents could see where she was without all of those constant distractions. So I thought that was kind of a cool compromise.
Yeah. And we'll talk about this some more when we get to high school, but this is one of the ways in which we're not just going to dismiss technology. When I was in high school, we lived out in the country. And at that time, it was a 25-mile drive along really deserted roads to get into the nearest town, which was Williamsburg. And until I went to college, I was not allowed to drive myself into Williamsburg because my parents were afraid. We had old cars. My parents were afraid that I would break down and be victimized. And we had no cell phones at that time, right? Because I remember saying to my father, they were called car phones back then. Can't we get a car phone? And he was like, oh, who can afford that? So, and I remember being very, very distressed because my brother was allowed to drive into town, but I was not, and saying how unfair it was. And my father said, yes, it is unfair. Welcome to the world. You're a girl. You can't drive all by yourself into Williamsburg. So I feel that, having a cell phone now is such a freedom. I mean, all of my kids got cell phones when they were in their teens. And it's such a relief to me to know that they can drive. They can go anywhere they want. And if they need help, they can contact me. That's a wonderful, wonderful technological advance. Right. So we want to make that aspect of technology as accessible as possible.
Right.
But what we don't want is them to just cruise the internet because they're bored.
Right. And that's where I think the gradual release of responsibility and use of technology is so important. And I think starting in the logic stage, we've talked about, students in the logic stage are kind of naturally wanting a little bit more independence. They're naturally wanting to fight back. They have big questions, these big why questions, things that they're going to want to research, things they're going to want to look up. And so it's a really natural time to start teaching them how to use the internet responsibly.
This is when you can really start to lean into what we would call digital literacy.
Right. So these skills of and I think this is a really, really important thing for parents to think about, is that just because kids can get into your phone and take a picture from the time they're 2 or can find settings that you can't find, they're what we call digital natives, doesn't actually mean that they know how to do research on the internet. And we can think our kids are really good with technology. They're better than me. But there's research that has been done by Stanford that shows that even though kids are quote, unquote digital natives, they're really, really not great unless they've been trained in figuring out what is a reliable source versus an unreliable source. These things aren't natural skills.
Right. And if I could put in a plug for the most recent edition of The Well-Trained Mind, we have a section in there about the difference between mediated and unmediated sources. A mediated source is one that has been fact-checked by somebody other than the author. And an unmediated source has simply been put out there by the author and or the author's friends without a disinterested third party certifying in any way that the information is correct. And it used to be that the internet was mostly unmediated sources and books were mediated sources, but this just isn't true anymore. Anybody can self-publish their own book. One of the things that kids have to learn in these important middle school years is the difference between information that has been checked by a disinterested third party and information that has not been. So that, for me, would be the number one goal during these middle school years, is teaching students what information has been fact-checked and what has not.
And there are resources that are coming up that are really good for doing that. The Stanford History Education Group, which is now called the Digital Inquiry Group, has free resources. They have a whole curriculum called the Civic Online Reasoning curriculum that I can link in the show notes, with lesson plans and things to dive into this. There are other groups that are creating great sources for teaching kids these skills. And the good news is that same group did more research, and I'll link all this in the show notes, that showed that that even though kids don't naturally know how to, research things online or tell the difference between a reliable and unreliable source, that these types of interventions, these types of lesson plans actually do make a big difference. So we can teach our kids these skills explicitly. And I think a middle school history class, a middle school science class is a really natural place to start incorporating this, because they're going to be doing research anyway, and they're going to be looking at the internet anyway. And so you can kind of weave in digital literacy and online research skills with those subjects.
So, and you had a recommendation, I believe.
Yes, the Digital Inquiry Group Civic Online Reasoning Lessons, which I will link in the show notes.
Great. And then also, Susanna, I think particularly in your work as a teacher, you've taught kids how to use actual programs.
Right. When you're starting a job, a lot of jobs now, maybe not all of them, but a lot of jobs will require using things like Microsoft Word, PowerPoint, Google Drive, and kids can start using those tools, even if they're using it at a very basic level. That's a lot less. It's a lot less overwhelming for them to start using, spreadsheets if they're familiar with Google Drive, for example. So kids can start creating, for example, PowerPoint presentations about something they're really excited about. Any subject in their school day. When I was little, we would have like a presentation time once a month, and we could make a presentation about anything that we were really excited about. And I remember doing one about North Dakota, and I was so excited about North Dakota because we were studying the states, and every kid had to get a state, and I chose North Dakota, and I tried to make North Dakota sound like the most exciting place in the world at my family presentation. And we would use, we used Apple products because my family was sort of a diehard Apple family, but we would use those tools. I think I was probably 4th or 5th grade when we started playing around with them. But things like Google Drive accounts or Microsoft accounts, you can have your students store their work online. When I was teaching, we used to do semi-regular organization check-ins, similar to like a locker clean out, where we would, I could see their screens and I could see how they were organizing their work on their Google Drive, and I could give pointers for ways that they could organize things. Ultimately, they chose their own organizational style, but just tips and tricks so that they're building good habits and learning these really foundational skills in the modern world from a young age.
Yeah. So, and there's so many programs out there. I don't know how many people still use PowerPoint. I know that my kids use Canva.
Oh yeah.
Whenever they do a presentation, actually my daughter 2 weeks ago said, I need to give the family a presentation because she had some ideas about how to organize our summer. And she used Canva for that. And it was quite good. But GarageBand, iMovie, there's so many programs out there.
And you can have so much fun with it. My sister did organized when we were studying the Civil War, late elementary, early middle school. She created an audio theatrical presentation about the life of Abraham Lincoln, and when she had us all as voice actors, and she used GarageBand and she put sound effects in, and it turned out really great for being made by an early middle schooler. But it was such a fun project, and we remembered what we learned from it for a long time. So there's a lot of creative, fun stuff you can do with it. iMovie, you could have them make little movies. These are skills that, learning the basics of those programs is going to make it way less overwhelming when they have to use it later on.
Well, and all of those things too are active. Everything that you're talking about is requiring children to interact with material and sort of represent it in not exactly the same way, but in an analogous way to writing a paper, writing an essay, giving a speech, right? So it's a technological version of interacting with material rather than simply absorbing it passively.
Right. And I think that's the really important thing, because there is so much great stuff on there, especially when it comes to like videos. You can watch crash course YouTube about almost any subject, whether it's American history, world history, economics. There's Khan Academy courses where you could watch videos about any subject. So it can be tempting to just say, okay, we want to learn economics. Here's a video course about economics. It's free online, and just watch the videos and be done. But, you still do need some form of output, some form of interaction with the material in a deeper way than just watching it. And again, you can do creative things. If let's say you take a crash course economics, but you add on to it some form of output, whether that's if you're an artistic kid, hand-drawn notes that are beautiful, and you design an interesting way to showcase the information you're learning. Or one thing my dad would do is he would give us a syllabus and basically materials that we took in, and then we had to make our own textbook as we went through the course. Or, creating a class to teach your younger siblings, doing a presentation, doing written responses. Some of these programs have built-in quizzes and tests like Khan Academy, but adding some sort of output to your input, or else, the videos you're just going to watch and they're going to go in one ear and out the other.
Well, and I think this is a really good caution for the middle grades, that just sitting your kid in front of a presentation, a video, a documentary does not mean that they're going to absorb anything about it. Part of good teaching, and you and I have both been classroom teachers, is getting is the give and take, the call and response, as it were, the getting the response from the kid about the content that you're giving them. And just playing something, playing a video, playing a documentary is not going to give you that sort of learning experience.
Right.
I do think that online classes can start to be useful for middle grade students because in some cases they're getting into more complex material that you as the parent don't have expertise in. It's really useful if you're not a math person to have someone who loves math teach your kid math.
Yeah.
If you're not a grammar person, having somebody that really understands how language works is a huge, huge bonus. But do recognize that for middle grade students, and we did a podcast on online education with some of these cautions in it. So some of you might want to go back and listen to that. Putting a kid in an online class where they're sitting and listening to a teacher lecture them is not necessarily going to give them that interactive experience, because they're not necessarily going to be mature enough to take advantage of it. I know I talked to the teachers at the academy, Tremont Academy, who teach middle grade courses, and they're like, I know that fifth grader's not paying attention. I know he's playing Minecraft on his other screen,
right?
But I can't do anything about it because the parent's not there supervising. So if you do make use of screen teaching, whether it's having the student watch something or whether it's having the student attend an online class, you have to be present as the parent. You got to be watching, you've got to be supervising, you've got to be poking the kid between the shoulder blades and saying, I see you're staring into the distance. Listen to the teacher. Have you responded? Have you done your assignment? You cannot trust a middle grade student to take the educational opportunity and make the most of it. It's not a character flaw.
Right.
It's immaturity. They won't do it.
Right. And if you do choose to do an online class or start, venturing into the world of online classes with your middle school student, that could be a natural way to start incorporating some of these other technological skills. Like they will inevitably be uploading their assignments somewhere. They will be using email to contact contact the teacher, organizing assignments on their computer. So it is a great way to start slowly introducing those skills as well.
And then if we can circle back around to the whole smartphone dilemma here, kids should have phones. Kids do not need to have smartphones. In the same way that we would not give kids unlimited access to our candy drawer, I don't think they need unlimited access to the internet via a smartphone. The immature brain cannot handle the constant dopamine hits, particularly from notifications, which tell you you're not alone in the world. You matter. People care about you. People think you're important, which of course is one of the great desires of middle school, is to know these things.
It is detrimental to their concentration. I saw it all day, every day at the school where I taught, where they were not supposed to have their phones with them in school, but they still brought them. And if they were in school, they were supposed to be in their locker, but they were still in the classroom. And it was a constant struggle to teach a student who consistently hid their phone, between their legs or under their desk. It was hard. It was hard to teach them anything because they were just constantly looking for the next dopamine hit from their phone notifications.
Well, in Virginia, we now have a mandate for what they're calling cell phone free education.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So all students in Virginia public school classrooms have to put their phones in their lockers and cannot access them during the day. So it's called bell to bell, meaning as soon as they get there, when the first bell rings, they've got to turn their phones off and store them, and they can't turn them back on until the end of the day, not even during lunch. So this is cell phone free education is sort of a new Virginia initiative.
And I think that's going to spread across the country in the next few years. I've seen a lot of headlines about that. It's something that I would really encourage parents to recreate in their home schools. And also if you are sending your kids to school, it can, because we weren't supposed to have our kids weren't supposed to bring their phones to school, but parents would send it with them for the safety thing. And then it was just, once it's at school, it's there. It's really hard to manage. So, having a not smartphone to send to school would make it a lot easier on teachers to manage.
Well, I think as we're talking to our home educating parents, when you're homeschooling your kids, you shouldn't be looking at your phone either. So we need to model the behavior that we want to see in our kids.
Right.
And listen, I have been guilty of this. I mean, I didn't actually have a smartphone when my kids were little because I'm old. But now, sometimes when I'm with my granddaughter, I find myself just, I'm just flipping through my phone and not paying attention to her. So that's something that we also have to. We have to resist the dopamine hit if we want them to resist it.
Right. Guilty as charged. That's something I need to work on as well.
All right. So moving on to high school.
Yes. In the rhetoric stage, in the high school years, this is where students have hopefully been building their skills with, technological tools, access to the internet. And now they're continuing to practice using the internet and other technologies as a tool. They may need explicit teaching where needed. So continuing to, explicitly teach how to use whatever the new technology is when, our kids are in high school, because that's rapidly changing. The new thing is AI, right? And there are ways that AI can be actually really useful. But if it's not explicitly taught as a tool, it's going to end up just being another distraction, another way to get around doing work the hard and true way.
The hard and true way. That's right. So obviously during the high school years, online classes can be such a great help to the home educator because the kids are getting into harder and harder stuff, subjects that you're not an expert in. And we have a whole episode on how to pick the right online school. But that episode really, and go back and listen to it, but it really emphasizes how important it is that whatever you're doing uses the screen as a delivery system for good traditional person-to-person teaching, as opposed to putting up videos, having the student watch them, and then respond to the videos by clicking a few buttons. That is not adequate high school education.
Right. Absolutely. And we already talked about this, but with the online class, they can access subject matter experts. They'll be challenged to use technologies as tools. They'll be able to, develop relationships with teachers and administrators, learn how to work with and ask for help properly from teachers and administrators, which is something I think a lot of students struggle with when they get to college, but they've only ever had a mom and a dad that they're working with. But they still do need some oversight, right? They can't be completely thrown to the internet and done. Mom and dad are off the hook.
Right. So I hope that those of you who are listening are gathering that we're not anti-technology in the slightest. You know what we're going to do? I'm going to send you this link, Susanna, and you can put it in the show notes. There's this wonderful, it's called Medieval Help Desk. I don't know if you've ever seen this Medieval Help Desk. All right. So it's this monk who has recently moved from scroll to a book, and he can't figure out how to open it. So he calls the Medieval Help Desk, and the guy shows up and he's like, so no, here's how you do it. He shows him how to open it, and then he leaves, and the monk is like, nope, wait, stop, because he's got the book now flipped around the other direction. Right. I can't open it now. And so he has to get the Medieval Help Desk to come back. Every new technology makes you think that there is a major change taking place in our brains, and that's bad and should be resisted. I'm not going to deny that a new technology means that major changes are going to take place in our brains. That is going to happen. All right. But this is part of living in the world. You know, Susanna, you and I now live in a world where you're in North Carolina, I'm in Virginia, and we work for the same company.
Right.
And we accept this. Our brains have been altered. We accept this as completely normal. Yes, the technology is going to alter our brains. What we have to do is meet the same challenge that all people have always been faced with meeting, is how do I live responsibly, joyfully, fully with this new technology? One of the things I love about this, the Medieval Help Desk skit, is it highlights a really interesting time in the evolution of knowledge, which is when books, and I think I've talked about this on the podcast before, so y'all have to forgive me for repeating myself, but when the bound book, when we think of a book, we think of, the bound thing with pages that you flip through. When it first became more common after the invention of the printing press, there was an entire sort of pre-Luddite movement that said, this is going to destroy the human brain. Because with a scroll, you have to start at the beginning of the scroll, and then you have to unroll it and roll it back up. And you have to follow this whole integrated chain of thought from beginning to end. With a book, it's so lazy. All you have to do is pick it up and you can flip it open. You can just go right to the conclusion and read the conclusion. What will happen to thought? What will happen to people's brains? Well, the book, or the codex is actually what we're talking about. The book did alter the way that we think. Yep. Screens are going to alter the way we think.
Right.
This is inevitable. We have to accept that and then think, how do we elevate discourse, think carefully, react responsibly, and live fully with this new technology?
Absolutely. And I honestly think that's a great place to close out the episode, because couldn't have said it better. It's going to be here with us, and now we're learning how to train our kids to use it responsibly.
Actually, maybe as we close out, maybe we should just mention a few of the screen things that we have found to be fun and interesting, and say why. Okay. So Susanna and I were talking about this before we started the episode, and we realized that both of the things that my kids used when they were little and the
things I used
are probably all totally passé, but that's fine. Right. Because the principle behind it is what's interesting. So my kids loved Magic School Bus computer games.
Oh.
Magic School Bus. And the reason why they loved Magic School Bus is because it was interactive. Because you would click on, the bus would go into like the human body or whatever, and you would click on something and there would be a response. Right? It wasn't just a passive sort of reception, but there was an actual interactive version of it. Did they learn anything about science? I don't know. Probably not. Right. But I will say they still, there was the Magic School Bus inside the human body was their absolute favorite. And there was this one game where you kind of went through the digestion, and like all of these things floated by, like there was a piece of cheese and there was a piece of a hamburger and there was chocolate, and they would click on it and each piece of food would talk.
Oh, that's fun.
So if they clicked on the cheese, it would say cheese, cheese, cheese. And all of us, to this day, my kids are between 22 and 32 now. Every time somebody takes a piece of cheese out of the fridge, everybody goes, cheese, cheese, cheese. So I bring this up not because they were learning great things about the human body, but screens can also help develop sort of a family culture.
Yeah.
Shared jokes. We've talked about this before on the podcast. Yeah. Shared quotes, things that we all remember with fondness. For them, it was Magic School Bus. They played a computer game called Rock Raiders, where where they had to go mine and collect things. I won't go too much into that. And they played Minecraft. And they invented things with Minecraft. They created worlds with Minecraft. It was a screen. I also happen to think it was a really valuable, imaginative exercise.
Yeah. My family was similar. We loved our computer games. Our favorites were Carmen Sandiego games. Carmen Sandiego Word Detective. There was a math one. Where in the World is Carmen Sandiego? And I was too little, but I watched my older brothers play them. And like you were saying with the shared family culture, like there are phrases from those games that we all still say. It was a shared experience that we really enjoyed. I loved watching my older brothers play computer games. And then we also had some movies that I loved that we watched over and over again. We had little 30-minute biographies from the animated hero classics. And I don't know if you can get them anymore. But again, things come and go so quickly in the technology space. We had these Leapfrog Learn to Read videos, which actually are still available, that my little brother used to learn some of his sounds. And I loved them because even though I was older, each letter came from this family, and each family had kind of something odd about them. So like the M's were all into eating, and they said and the B's were all into Beethoven, and they all like ba 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 ba. And as the movie would go along, you were like, well, what's the next letter family going to be like, and what's their oddity going to be? So I just remember loving to watch those with my little brother, even though I already knew how to read. So those little movies, those little 30-minute cartoons were such a fun part of our childhood that we still share today as adults. Things in common, the computer games, the same. And then for my family, because my family were so into Apple, we literally would sit down and watch the new Apple keynotes with what was coming out. Like most people watch the Super Bowl, like with snacks and people shouting at the screen. Like we just, and so having a lot of fun with those programs like iMovie and GarageBand, and all the memories we made building projects on those, I'll always treasure.
It's like the Michael Pollan advice about eating. You know, he says, eat food, not too much of it, mostly plants. That'll be our advice for screens. Use screens, not too much of it, mostly entertainment.
Fair.
Right? Yep.
I love that. Awesome. Well, thank you all for listening to this episode. We cannot wait to hear your thoughts.
We would love for you guys to send us your favorite screen stuff.
Yeah.
We'd love to know, what are your kids playing? What are they finding helpful? What are they finding helpful and or entertaining?
Right.
Yeah, send us your experiences. We'd love to know.
Thank you for listening to the Well-Trained Mind podcast. You can find Susan at facebook.com/susan.wise.bauer and Susanna on Instagram at hopintohomeschool. Our engineering and mixing is done by AJ Falari at ajfalari.online. This podcast is produced by Well-Trained Mind Press, and our supervising producer is Chris Bauer. If you enjoyed the show, help us out by rating and reviewing us wherever you listen to podcasts. If you have questions, responses, or ideas for future episodes, email us at podcast@welltrainedmind.com. We'll be back next week, so stay tuned.